You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Cullen. I'm joined by Brad Hunt, and today we are back with our series, our book series, our Gritty Book Club. We're reading Crow Killer, the Saga of Liver-Eating Johnson. Where we left off last week, or last episode, he had gone into the Civil War.
Yep.
Prior to that, though, after his escape from the Blackfeet, where he had cut one of the sentry's legs off and then escaped and ate that man's leg.
Yep.
He comes back with all the
gathers up
mountain
his
men,
buddies.
40 of them. Some legendary names are in the mix, mountain men names, and they go and they slaughter the Blackfeet Indian.
Yep.
That whose leader was the wolf, and they slay that crew.
70 of them.
Yeah, basically kill 70 of them, right? I think all of them.
I think so, because I got to think about it. It's like, okay, they got 69 scalps they threw in front of Mr. Johnson, and
but the other guy killed 2.
Yeah, so we had 68, 70 minus the 2, and they threw the wolf's head.
They pretty much killed them all.
Yep,
I believe.
Yep.
And so that's the story. And then he goes off to the Civil War after that, and now he's back. And now that he's back, he fought the last Crow Indian of the 20 warriors that they sent after him over the 15 years, near 15 years.
Something like that, 14.
It was one-on-one combat. He kills that Crow Indian. It's over.
Yep.
Hand-to-hand combat. And, yeah, he's eating his biscuits. and so now we're back to the story. And by the way, the Blackfeet are pissed, and they put a bounty on him, saying anyone who kills him and takes his scalp becomes a chief.
Yeah, and Johnson's like, yeah, cool, whatever. I have more respect for the Crow than you guys. So,
so here we have it. In the year 1866, the greatest concentrations of hostile Indians ever seen in the West began a series of military engagements and massacres that lasted into the early 1870s. Eventually, just as he had been drawn into the Civil War, Johnson would find himself swept into the general fighting. Yet ideally, to Johnson's way of thinking, even such enemy strength should be met by the might and the guile of individual mountain men. Army forces might be necessary to protect settlers, but when a detachment of soldiers was surrounded and helpless before the Indian foe, there must be one mountain man, a Portuguese Phillips, say, to get through and report the soldiers' plight. Johnson's real reverence for individual achievement and his concern for the legend appear strikingly in the help he gave Phillips and his effort to hide that help from men's knowledge. If Phillips recounted how his ride through the blizzard waste, glorious as it was, would have ended in disaster without Johnson's help, why Johnson had done what he could to make the adventure seem Phillips's alone. We're going to get into it. It's a little confusing right there, but basically what happens is Portuguese Phillips does this sort of heroic he goes to get support, backup for the military. He's a mountain man. He sneaks away while they're under siege, and he heroically tells reinforcements that they need to come and save him, and so it happens. The Sioux, especially, were on the warpath, and they drew into their fighting orbit the Cheyennes, the Arapahoes, the Blackfeet, and for a time some Crows. The Sioux, they don't like to be referred by that, by the way. It's the Sioux are the Lakota Indians, and the Sioux is a French term, French word for the Indians that was common back then.
Yep,
it's a vernacular from the time. The Sioux were thus the leaders of all those tribes who came to feel that if so many white men came now to settle among them, then already they meant to seize all the lands of the vast West for themselves. Thus, the Indians could lose nothing by resisting. Every settlement was attacked or in fear of attack. Every trail was an Indian target. Along the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming, for example, whites were massacred by the hundreds. On July 15, 1866, Colonel H.B. Carrington, 18th United States Infantry, and his command reached a point some 65 miles north of the deserted Fort Reno, and there built Fort Kearny in the very heart of Red Cloud's Sioux domain. So at this time, you have Red Cloud, you have Sitting Bull, you have...
Yep. Sitting Bull's like the famous Lakota chief or whatever.
Sort of the more peaceful one who's up north toward Canada a little bit more. And then you had Crazy Horse, who is more of a warrior.
Yeah.
Crazy Horse was a leader of young warriors, more or less, kind of
like fierce warriors.
But also sort of a medicine. He had medicine man, like, but a warrior, nonetheless. Never. He's a fascinating story, and I love the story of Crazy Horse, and I really appreciate the Sioux Lakota Nation and their sort of their ethos of life.
Yeah. So right here it says, only men, this is talking about the Lakotas, the Sioux, it says, only men who had earned the right through an act of bravery could wear a grizzly bear claw necklace. So you had to, like, earn that. I
think the Sioux, the Lakota only had one child every 7 years as well. A lot of nomadic tribes did the same.
Yep.
Lots of interesting. I've read the book on here, or touched on it a few times, Land of the Spotted Eagle, written by Luther Standing Bear. So here we are. This is the time frame. So Red Cloud has surrounded. Red Cloud had promises from Washington that no whites would be stationed or allowed to settle in his territory. As early as July 17, I think Red Cloud was in jail at some point. But anyway, as early as July 17, his warriors ran close to the fort site and drove off some stock. There never was an hour in all the building and active maintenance of the hated fort on the Little Piney when the Sioux did not post their warriors about it. And indeed, when the fort was at last left empty, they rushed in and set fire to all the buildings and stockade, with the soldiers only 3 miles away. Now the fort seemed well situated for defense on a plateau between the Little Piney Creek and the Big Piney. But those within its walls must face not only the Lakota, but also the cold of winter. One of the coldest winters as was to develop in the history of Wyoming. The 250 who were to man the fort accordingly must include some 15 woodcutters. Red Cloud determined to strike at the woodcutters first, but in such a manner as to draw the soldiers from inside their fortifications. He was determined to destroy every man and woman and child in the fort, but in order to do so, he must let one woodcutter escape. What seemed a mere hunting party of Sioux accordingly fell on the woodcutters. The one survivor reaching the fort told his story to Colonel Carrington and Carrington's Lieutenant Captain William J. Fetterman. Fetterman, a valiant soldier, at once urged that the Sioux hunting party must be punished. Carrington gave him the permission he sought, but with qualifications. He must not go beyond Lodgepole Ridge. Quickly gathering a troop of some 80 soldiers, both infantry and cavalry, Fetterman marched over the snowy plain toward the woods. Now, this whole, draw them out. So if you look at the wild and you see, there's this decoy process where you send this little temptation, you get people to come out and attack them and kill them while there's a huge ambush waiting. The Indians' classic, favorite method of killing. And it strikes me as very interesting that these European folks, these colonial, these settlers, they seem to fall for this
every time. Every time.
It's like, what the hell, guys? They just totally underestimate. You're unbeatable in the fort.
Yeah,
just about. The native people do not have. They don't have the weaponry to blow up the fort. They don't have cannons and so forth. They can't rush the gap. Man, and yet here they go, and both the infantry and the cavalry, they go over the snowy plain toward the woods. There were no Indians to be seen. This is 80 soldiers. When he reached Lodgepole Ridge in quiet, Fetterman decided that if he were to give the red men a lesson, he must follow them further. So he disobeys order. He ordered his infantrymen to ride double on the mounts of the cavalrymen. In fact, the infantrymen could easily have marched as much further as they were to go. Fetterman and his 80 rode over the ridge and into it. So everybody hopped on the back of a horse, and so there was 2 men to each horse, and they rode their way into this ridge and into a small clearing in a depression. The landscape all around erupted. 1,000 Sioux fell upon them. So you got 80 men and 1,000 Indians. Now, in their defense, the native folks never really got big numbers amassed because really there wasn't one single nation. There was just a disparate group of tribes all over, and just to get everybody on the same page to agree to one thing was pretty unusual. Plus, you have to look at it logistically. You get 1,000 Indians together. What are they going to eat?
Right.
Because they don't store goods. They kind of hunt and eat and gather as they go. That many people in one spot, there's not enough resources to feed everyone, and so it has its problems. And the horses come, and you got 1,000 Indians or 2,000 Indians, and you have 1,000 horses, 2,000 horses. Those horses graze, and they just kill everything right off the bat. It's a logistic nightmare, and so
those horses are competing with all the ungulates that are there too. You know, your deer, your buffalo.
So it's kind of unusual for a body of Indians to amass to this number.
Right.
But at this time, you're talking Custer Last Stand type period. The Indians were gathering in massive numbers to go in these massive fights and to destroy
the white man.
And so the massacre that followed has won reputation as more macabre than any other of its sort, just as Red Cloud himself has won a name among the fiercest of Indian warriors, and along with the great Oglala Sioux, or Lakota, Crazy Horse, as the greatest of Indian strategists. There were no survivors. The dead were mutilated beyond recognition. Many were clubbed until every bone in their body was broken. Jeez. Such was the answer of Red Cloud to the encroachment of the army. Colonel Carrington was now left with a pitifully small garrison to meet the attack that Red Cloud would surely soon be making. Even so, he would order no soldier to go for help. The nearest possible reinforcements were at Fort Laramie, 236 miles away. 236 miles, that is to say, after a courier got through the Sioux warriors ringing the fort. The Indians would, of course, be expecting a courier. They would be ready to ambush him on every trail. No soldier had the hardihood for such a trip anyway, and weather 25 degrees below zero.
Wyoming, never. It's not cold.
25 degrees below zero. No soldier could have found the way in the constant snows, but would have frozen to death in the wilderness. Colonel Carrington asked for volunteers, but can hardly have been surprised when only a mountain man stepped forward, John Portuguese Phillips.
Yeah.
Phillips was a tall, heavily bearded scout with extraordinary qualifications for the assignment. The several Indian languages at his command were but one proof of how well he knew the tribesmen themselves. His trigger finger was respected by all the hostiles. He knew all the rocks and gullies near the Bozeman Trail, not simply as rugged or picturesque scenery, but for the possibilities of ambush they afforded. Said the scout to the colonel, "All I want is the best horse in the post and my saddlebags full of biscuits." Said the colonel to the scout, "You may have my horse, Phillips, and anything else you may need." Phillips knew well enough which was the best horse on the post. The colonel's chestnut Arabian was often called the best piece of horse flesh in the entire West, and Carrington must have known he would never see the horse again. Even should Phillips get through, he must surely be able to do so only by pushing to the very limit of the animal's endurance and then beyond. Perhaps in dramatization of the circumstances which could force him to give up such a horse, Carrington issued an order as Phillips left. All the women and children were to remain constantly in the arsenal. The soldier there in charge must touch match to powder should the Indians gain entrance to the stockade. Clearly, if Red Cloud could strike before reinforcements could come, the fort must fall. Portuguese Phillips completed his preparations for the ride before dark on the day after the twin massacres. His biscuits, fresh baked, were stowed in his bags, his horse saddled and bridled, but by an orderly, with Carrington himself looking on, and he went to the gate. Carrington had prevailed upon him to wear an army coat. The scout himself had checked and rechecked his own arms, 2 Colt revolvers, a Bowie knife, and a Spencer repeating rifle, more reliable now than the model issued only 2 years before when Johnson used it. John C. Bro, the Sentry, told later how the colonel came with Phillips to the gate and stroked for a moment the silken mane of his thoroughbred. "May God be with you," he said softly to Phillips. The scout gathered up the reins, nudged the chestnut, and slipped through the opening and out upon the Bozeman Trail. He had embarked on a ride as lonely and terrible as any in military history, as terrible in its way as liver-eating Johnson's forced march had been on his way back from Blackfoot captivity. Phillips did not stick to the Bozeman Trail, for he could not count on the Indians patrolling that now deserted artery. He knew that the Indians would be there.
Yeah.
He paralleled the road wherever he could, but anywhere from 2 to 5 miles off of it. The snow had stopped falling for the last few hours before he left the fort, and he could ride for a time at a stiff canter. I guess what it says is that he knew at every hour he could shave off the trip, like might be the difference between them being completely massacred or saved. So he basically makes his way there. I'll make your sleeping time with shortcuts. He says Phillips did indeed sleep. After his coffee and steaks, some 2 hours before daylight, he was awakened by Johnson's nudge. He sprang to his feet and saw before him 2 saddled horses, his own mount, and the Crow Killer's powerful black. "I'll just show Portuguese over the rough parts," Johnson said, as if addressing only Beadler. "Watch your scalp." The 2 men mounted and were almost at once on their way. At daybreak, they looked ahead over a country dead and barren and cold, what each had seen for generations of winters in this wilderness. Johnson's breath turned his great beard into a solid block of ice. The northwest wind, starting up now, almost swept the horses off their feet. Yet there was reason to be grateful even for such a wind when Johnson turned their course toward to the southeast and thus put the wind behind them. "We are plenty below Casper now," he told Phillips. The scout nodded. Taking advantage of their tailwind, they put their horses into a gallop to thunder across vast plains from which the snow they swept, blah, blah, blah. Phillips knew that their shortcuts had already saved him any time lost in the last night's sleep, and this must be their last rest. Johnson produced more antelope steak from his saddlebags, and Phillips furnished the last of the biscuits along with a cannikin of coffee. Phillips saw how closely Johnson studied the Arabian as both horses were unsaddled and rubbed down, their blankets warmed over the fire and replaced. When at last both horses and men had eaten, they had a brief exchange about Phillips' chances. "It's 100 miles to Laramie if your horse makes it," Johnson said. "Oh, I think we'll make out," Phillips answered. Both men felt as they rose to saddle again, how during their hour's rest the wind had risen, bringing promise of a blizzard. Johnson saw no reason now for sparing even the Arabian. They thundered ahead at a stiff gallop, hoping to stay ahead of the storm. So basically, now that they have a storm coming hard, they're like, we just got to go and ride this horse into the dirt. There's no more resting, no more taking our time. Within 4 hours, they reached the Platte and found it frozen to its bottom. The river furnished them an excellent trail, so they kept to it, tight to its bank for more than 40 miles. So that cut off some, just being able to just ride through the river, right on top of the river. But when they were perhaps 20 miles from Laramie, Johnson surprised Philip by ordering a halt. Once more, they built a small fire in the lee of the riverbank. Once more, they thawed themselves out. The Crow Killer inspected the Arabian. "This horse is about done," he said. "I still think we'll make it," Phillips answered him. You can make it, Portuguese, but you better take it easy." Phillips looked at Johnson with astonishment. "Ain't you going on with me?" Johnson shook his head. "Plenty might like to, but not this coon," he said, and busied himself over the fire, knocking the last icicles to earth from his beard. "You see, Portuguese, this ride'll make make history for you. So they shook hands, and he mounted his horse, and they rode away, and Phillips for Laramie and Johnson back over the trail they had come together on.
Yep.
The blizzard fell furiously upon Laramie. Now, is this apocryphal or real? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, it says, like, I was looking here, and it talks about, it says, initially, everybody thought that he went, like, 235 miles on his own on the trek. Ended up there, like, no, after, talking with people and stuff, that there were multiple men, as you can see. John Johnson gets with him. So there were, like, multiple men that helped him along that journey, But for the whole journey, he was only paid, only back in these times, it's probably pretty good money, but for the whole thing, he was paid like $300.
Well, isn't he, so? I guess he's a scout. He's not. He's not actually officially a military guy.
I believe so.
So he's kind of paid on the side. Not surprised by that.
Yep.
So this is going to make him famous, he says. And they part ways. Let me see here. Where was I? The blizzard fell furiously upon Laramie this Christmas Eve. The swirling snow started once more to mount over the already deep-covered prairies. Once again, the temperature fell to 40 below now. Shoo! Dang! Oh! If you've been below 10 degrees below zero, I've been in places where it's 20.
Yeah.
Your nose hairs freeze, your eyelashes freeze, they break off. Like, it feels like the liquid in your eye freezes. Right. Everything just freezes, and it's like 1,000 needles to your skin.
Yes.
If it's uncovered, it's getting frostbite.
Yep. Oh, exactly.
And this is 40 below. I've been in 30 below. It's just so cold. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, then you throw wind chill and stuff like that into it, and it's freaking miserable.
It'll kill you in a short order.
Right.
Short order.
Very short.
The wind howled down out of the frozen north, the sentry walking his gate post, his lips chapped and cut, even though he clung to the lee side of the stockade, thought what it must be like in the open, thought that no man could live long in the storm outside the fort. Then he knew suddenly that the sound at the gate was not of wind alone. He swung the gate wide. A rider urged his horse, braced against the wind, on slowly into the courtyard. The sentry, even as he closed and barred the gate, saw the gaunt, stiff rider dismount. After a few more halting steps, the animal fell. The sentry saw the rider stagger up the steps toward the door of the post's Bedlam house, where the officers and their wives danced on this holiday eve. Portuguese Phillips twisted open the door, pointed to his breast pocket, and then, like his horse, fell forward. The messages Phillips carried in 3 days' ride served their vital purpose. Reinforcements reached Fort Phil Kearny before Red Cloud could strike. The first of Colonel Carrington's message to the general, who could send him immediate help, read thus: Fort Phil Kearny, December 21st, 1866, by courier to Fort Laramie. General G.O. Cook, do send me reinforcements forthwith. Expedition now with my force impossible. I risk everything but the post and its stores. I venture as much as anyone can, but I have had today a fight unexampled in Indian warfare. My loss is 94 killed. I have recovered 49 bodies, and 35 more are to be brought in the morning. I need prompt reinforcements and repeating arms. I am sure to have an active winter and must have men in arms. Promptness is the vital thing. Give me officers and give me men. Fetterman was a fool.
Yep.
Fool. Just like Custer. Like, how many fools, just their arrogance in these Indian fights. And, if he had done what his leader had told him and not gone past the ridge,
right,
down into the trap,
yep,
then they'd almost all be alive. They'd go back to the fort. There's no Portuguese Phillips. There's no John Johnson. There's no need for reinforcements. Like, just the costliness of such,
but egotistic, like, want to
self-assurance. I'm going to teach the red man. Is what he says. And it's like, they seek glory.
Right.
They seek this, and
Power.
And it just destroys them. You see it. I mean, you see it throughout history. I mean,
yes. No comment on that.
The second of the messages Phillips carried from Carrington was to General U.S. Grant and proposed not defense but a remounted offense. General, I want all my officers, I want men. Depend upon it, as I wrote in July, no treaty but hard fighting is to assure this line. But to open and guarantee this line, I must have reinforcements and the best of arms. As those notes were first read in Fort Laramie, liver-eating Johnson rode ahead into the storm. His powerful black snapped and bit at the snowflake's sting. His thoughts were surely with Phillips, but just what he may have thought about Phillips we cannot know. Perhaps he was sure enough of his own estimate of man and horse alike to know that Phillips would have made it by now to Laramie, or perhaps he merely hoped Phillips might have made it, and thought Phillips's chance for glory worth risking the lives of the 150 still manning an army fort. The rigors of that extraordinary winter were too harsh for another of the mountain people, Miss John Morgan, Crazy Woman, along with the provisions liver-eating Johnson and some of his friends brought her. Crazy Woman depended on what game she could shoot. That winter, it seems, she went blind from a blow she had received from the Blackfeet, who descended upon all her family 20 years before. Early in the spring that came at last, Johnson heard the old woman had starved to death.
Jeez.
So, 20 years.
Yep.
Crazy Woman was there for 20 years before she was reattacked by a crow.
Tough little girl.
Became blind and then died.
Yep.
Starved to death. Interesting.
All by herself, middle of nowhere.
That was a nasty winter, 1866.
Yep.
December 21st,
so
right around Christmas.
So I was reading right here. It says after Portuguese Phillips died, which was like in 1883, said the government was slow to recognize Portuguese Phillips for his heroic deeds, in part because his status as a U.S. citizen had been in question. It ended up granting his widow $5,000 for his service to the Army 32 years after the historic ride.
Wild. I mean, dude, these are hard times, hard men. So he lived for 17 or 18 years or something like that after
the ride.
1866. He died in
1883, so it was like, 17 years?
Yeah.
Something like that. And if any of you have ridden in a saddle when it's cold outside,
your feet turn to ice.
It's freaking miserable.
It's so your legs and feet are so exposed.
You're not moving. Your blood's not flowing. Like, I don't know. It's miserable.
But he wasn't walking it.
No.
Although that could be better in some ways. But when I traveled in snow that deep, a horse could move so much more efficiently. Unless you have snowshoes, and even then.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think
like without snow and stuff, I can outwalk a horse all day.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've proven it. We've had horses.
Same with when you're in northern Canada or Alaska.
Yep.
And you're dealing with
but then you get into tall brush or tall snow. That's where they
chest deep willows.
Yeah.
And those horses just seem to step through it. Dude, you bushwhack. You don't get anywhere.
No. You think about a moose.
It's amazing what
over time, moose have evolved to have 8 feet long legs.
Yes, seriously. I go on a moose hunt here in a few days, and I am so freaking stoked.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting. I could go the whole 10 days and not see a single moose, though. I've experienced that sort of experience up north. But I'm hoping that because it's the rut, it's just off the chain. But you never know. We'll see. It's a DIY. Me and Lampers and I.
Cool.
So... Okay, so that's the story. So Johnson was supposedly apocryphally involved in this.
Yeah. And they say, like I said, when I read that, they said there were others that were involved in that. I don't know for how long of a period.
Surely him knowing the terrain in the area, he would know how to connect with all the different mountain men along the way that are part of his clan and stuff. Yep. And it wouldn't surprise me that he went to one dude, the next dude, and the next dude their areas where they're roaming or staying for the winter and enlist some help and some supplies or some heat.
Yep.
Okay, continuing with the book. Even so confirmed an individualist as liver-eating Johnson must share in such defense of settlers, women, children, as at Fort Hawley in 1869. His distinctive contribution, however, the eating of a Sioux liver, was by way of command performance required by those very mountain men who had helped him to vengeance against the Blackfeet. I don't know what I just read. Fort Hawley, named for an army man and fur wholesaler who never saw the place, was a trading post and rendezvous for hunters and trappers from all the far west. In 1869, it was in charge of one Captain Andrews and his small detachment of soldiers. Johnson, arriving on routine business, found there a number of settlers who had been driven from their homes by the Lakota. Many of their people had been killed, and the smoke and flames of burning cabins were to be seen along all that stretch of the Missouri. Already, many mountain men had offered their help. Among them was Delgue and his last winter's partner, Jim Deere. Beadler was there, and hoary-headed Bear Claw Chris Lapp. Bear Claw had pretty much retired from violence, settling down instead to the sale of his special necklaces to an excellent new market, the Tenderfeet, on river steamboats. But he had come out from his cabin in the Little Rockies for the present emergency. Hatchet Jack Ireland was in the band as well, with his adopted father, Mad Mose. The few soldiers present kept themselves in the stockade some 50 yards from the trading post, and Johnson, like the rest of the mountain men, camped outside where they had stomping room. While keeping a lookout for hostiles that had repaired their gear or fished in the muddy Missouri, at times indeed, such contempt they had for their foe, they let their guard down altogether. Each knew himself worth more than a company of soldiers in his countryside, so familiar to them. In the quiet weeks they whiled away, a number of other trappers came in. One, the famous Indian fighter George Grinnell, reported that there was no sign of Indians anywhere nearby. They too, 2 days after the Grinnell brought such a word, Johnson and Delgue, fishing from cottonwood stumps in the riverbank, heard a woman scream. Seizing their rifles, they ran to the top of the river, on toward where they had seen two women picking Juneberries in the brush, one white, the other Indian. The white woman, Jenny Smith, was still lying where she had been scalped alive. The Indian woman, racing toward the fort, was hit in the buttocks by a shot from the now retreating foe. Other mountain men, too, were racing toward the scene. Their short examination showed that Jenny Smith had suffered no harm other than the loss of her scalp. And indeed, Beadler's manuscripts show that the woman lived many years with a wig to cover her only wound. A pan of water thrown into her face revived her.
Jeez.
Dude, I've been bald for a long time, but
right.
not scalped.
Right.
Like, and especially as a woman, that's a bummer.
Yep.
You don't want that. That's a bad way to go.
Sometimes that's what makes you pretty is your hair.
Johnson, the story runs, wasted some 2 minutes in cussing himself out for believing Grinnell's story. I've been smelling them Sioux for an hour, but in a moment's time, the chase was on. There was a willow belt running parallel with the river through which the Sioux tried to escape. But the Indians had not reconnoitered enough. Pressed close and fearing the deadly aim of the mountain men, they dropped into a dry wash at the end of the timber. The wash was blind, and they were boxed. Their only hope was that the trappers would leave the timber and run toward them as easy targets. But the mountain men knew that they had the Sioux trapped, and that not one of them could leave the wash alive. Johnson and the rest needed only wait until dark to make their move. Through the remaining hours of daylight, the Sioux seemed to take some amusement from the mountain men's deadly aim. Again and again they thrust their coup sticks above the rim of the wash, and as if an admission that those sticks would never again be of use to them, again and again their sticks were shot cleanly in two.
Jeez.
Come twilight, Johnson and Delgue crawled on their bellies through the small willow scrub at the end of the wash. They discovered the Indians had barricaded their position, and heavy shields made from the neck skin of bull buffaloes, and they hung blankets to keep the mountain men from taking aim. Had the trappers still carried their old light-caliber Hawkins rifles or even the heavier Spencer repeaters, the shields might have effectively turned their bullets, but instead each man carried the hardest-hitting rifle ever seen on the western plains, the .56 caliber Springfield. known as a needle gun because the firing pin, several inches in length, ran through the heaviest breechlock ever built into a rifle. The 3-ounce lead bullet from this gun, with its heavy powder charge, would go right through a running buffalo.
Jeez.
A little cannon.
Knock you on your butt. Like, I would hate to shoot that.
Dell crawled back to the heavy timber to report. Soon the entire band of whites was lined up before the mouth of the wash for what would clearly be nothing more than a riddling of the Sioux. Their first volley killed more than a third of the Indians. The rest, realizing at once that they must die, began singing their death songs. Then, gracefully conceding to superior firepower, they climbed the rim of the wash and were felled. One of them, not killed by lying with both hips smashed by a single bullet, sang while Jim Deere approached him, placed muzzle to his head, and pulled the trigger. But because the caps on the muzzle loader were wet, Deere snapped all around the cylinder without effect. At last, he picked up a stone with which to dash out the warrior's brains, but Johnson, intervening, shot the Indian dead. There was little celebrating to be done after such a massacre, aside from the usual collection of scalps and other valuables, but Hatchet Jack did conceive what might entertain his other fellows. Even chew on a Sioux liver-eating Johnson? Ever chew on a Sioux liver-eating Johnson? The other mountain men gathering around left Johnson no alternative but to chew, or to suggest that his liver-eating was only a legend. In a wordless answer, he stooped over the Sioux he had just killed. Soon he had the liver in his hands. Delgue alone, it seems, turned away in disgust. Holding the trophy for all to see, Johnson sank his teeth into the dripping flesh. "I can see how you earned your name, said George Grinnell. "Great Jehoshaphat, Pocahontas, and John Smith," old Bear Claw cried. And cried out the suggestion that there had never been any doubt. He was eaten way back in Hatcher's time. Johnson spat out some gristle. "Dell don't like it," he said. "Makes him gag." So here, the reason this part is in the story is because the liver-eating portion is no longer just a story told by Delgue, but it's told by all these other witnesses who were there and who also tell of this experience outside the fort of what happened. And so the conclusion is that this is not unique for John Johnson, and that, this is now corroborated that this is what he did when he killed. Now, he was doing this to the Sioux as insult, to the Crow, he does this just to show he does it among his...
Yeah, proving a point, really.
Johnson never did finish that last of the livers he ate. He turned aside instead to direct the boiling down of 32 skulls for mounting on poles. Peter Koch, in his journal, reports the effect on the passengers of the steamer Huntsville landing at Fort Hawley some days later. This is what he wrote. "A sight met her passengers which was certainly calculated to shock the nerves of any eastern tenderfoot. Along the brink of the river bank, on both sides of the landing, a row of stakes was planted, and each stake carried a white, grinning Indian skull. They were evidently the pride of the inhabitants, and a little to one side, as if guarding them, stood a trapper, well known throughout eastern Montana by the name of Liver-Eating Johnson. He was leaning on a crutch with one leg bandaged, and the day being hot, his entire dress consisted of a scant, much shrunken red undershirt, reaching just below his hips. His matted hair and brushy beard fluttered in the breeze, and his giant frame and limbs, so freely exposed to view, formed an exceedingly impressive, characteristic picture." Big giant Viking. X. Beadler, writing of the same occasion in his journal manuscripts, and incidentally erring to the date, suggested that the Sioux liver was the first eaten by Johnson. But then the stories invented about Johnson's liver eating were often ludicrously off the mark. Take S.D. Shackelford's, for example, as he passed on by pack saddled by Greenborough. It says he wrote, in 1973, two young men met in St. Louis, John Johnston and John A. Mann. Johnson had, of course, been in the West for 30 years by 1873 and was no longer really young.
Yep.
Proceeding on his journey to the West, Johnson went first to a town named Colson on the Yellowstone. In fact, the young Colson, for whom Colson was named, was not born until 1879 and was not brought to the new town until 1880. Shackelford's story itself has young Johnston failing to kill his first Indian until 1882. 9 years after the boast to A. Man. By 1882, the real Johnson was almost 60. In 1882, when Billings had replaced Colson, a young tenderfoot arrived in town. This tenderfoot, who wore yellow button shoes, straw hat, seersucker coat, and linen duster, was allowed by Johnson to go on a scouting trip with him to the Big Snowy Mountains. Johnston killed 2 Indians, and when the tenderfoot, who had apparently been hiding, appeared, the scout cut the liver from one, rubbed it on his face, and the young man got sick. We may pass over those stories of how Johnson or John Johnson earned his name, as cited already in the acknowledgments. We may go on to how, just before eating the Sioux liver, the crow killer made peace with the crow. We may then tell how, when, even in bitter warfare against the Sioux, liver-eating Johnson kept largely aside from such debauchery and blood as he had been engaged in near Fort Hawley. There's a lot of citations down here and just rumors and stuff that people have of this event. So this kind of, this is not a perfect history.
Yeah.
But something was going down.
Right.
There's, all legends have, all stories begin from a kernel of truth. How much, we don't know.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep. Absolutely.
But after hearing about the West and hearing about just those times, you're talking about just a wild time.
Yeah.
And these things are not actually all that surprising to me, being more familiar with history as the years have gone on. Not surprised at all. So, what'd you think, Brad?
It's always interesting. You all can keep eating liver. I'll pass. No, thank you.
So we got a few more pages here. I'm going to dive into this and keep on going with the story. But it's interesting how they talk about the weapons, the guns, how those Indians, after they attacked, they really probably young, inexperienced, and then they got themselves trapped boxed in, and they had some nasty, tough mountain men to deal with, and those mountain men just cleaned house.
Yep.
Okay. In the winter of 1868 and 69, so we're going back a little bit. 1866 was Portuguese Phillips' wild ride.
Yep.
The crow killer and ex-beadler, having no commitments to the military, resolved to set out trapping. After months on scouts' pay, they were pinched financially. More important, they would break the monotony of hanging around army posts. Instead of setting out for any of the richest fur fields, they went to Beadler's comfortable cabin in the Big Belt Mountains. Though glad of the privacy of one another's company, they worked assiduously, and surprisingly enough, they did bring in a good winter's haul. Thus, they came out of the belts in March with 2 pack horses heavily loaded. The winter's lonely activity, the spring's freshness, and the very sort of scrape they met with Blackfeet, all were as simple as in young John Johnson's first seasons in the 25 years ago. So it says that small parties of crows and Blackfeet were on their springtime move, some to trade and others to kill, or more likely all of them to see what adventures they might meet. It was 20 young Blackfoot warriors seeking to make a name for themselves by gathering white scalps who followed the trail of the 2 trappers. It's sort of like deja vu.
Yeah, right.
When they came close enough to see the quarry's packs of furs, they must have been certain they would gain both wealth and fame. What they did not know, any more than it had some of their tribesmen a generation earlier, was that the prosperous trappers were not as sleepy as they looked. Johnson had smelled them out on the first day of their trailing. As Beadler remarked, if in them red devils knew who they was trailing, they'd be making tracks the other way. The 2 mountain men waited only for ground. The Blackfeet would think apt for an ambush to prepare their own. There would be no moon. The ground they chose for their own encampment and for the Blackfoot descent upon them was the famous camping site on the forks near the headwater of the Musselshell, west of Pompey's Pillar. At the confluence of the left fork in the river itself, they made such a fire that had not even the least experienced party of raiders could miss that.
Jeez.
Such a fire indeed, they that any but fledglings must expect a trap. So they basically are like, hey, here we are, and it should have been a red flag to the approaching Indians, but it wasn't. The smoke from the trappers' green brush and young spring shoots could be seen for miles. The dry driftwood they had added would keep the fire going. As dusk came on, this is like decoying a buck or
right.
a turkey, As dusk came on, baiting a trap, As dusk came on, the trappers tethered their horses safely away from the fire, walked back a few feet along the trail, then posted themselves on either side in the rocks and the brush. Each had a new improved Spencer repeater and 2 revolvers. An hour passed, 2 and then 3 hours. The Blackfeet had dismounted. Now, one thing that I think is under-mentioned, is the weaponry disparity between the mountain men and the Indians often.
Right. Most of the time the Indians, they're bow and arrow, spear, club.
Musket.
Yeah. If they were lucky to have a musket.
And here we have, they did have rifles at times, but you're talking about some serious weaponry that these guys have.
Yeah.
And these Indians are playing with fire. So a couple hours, 2 or 3 passes, the Blackfeet had dismounted a mile from the forks and were creeping forward, spread out along both sides of the trail. But as yet, even Johnson had heard no sound of them. Soon the campfire would have burned out. Soon, on this moonless night, there would be no light by which foe could be seen. Here they come, X. Beadler heard his partner's low voice from across the trail at last. He had expected that Johnson would remark the young Blackfeet coming first, but even now that Johnson had alerted him, he could hear nothing more than the crackling and hissing of dry logs burned almost through. So he's superhuman hearing as well. He cuddled his rifle stock against his cheek and took comfort in his certainty that across the trail liver-eating Johnson stood in identical position. He gazed down the trail. At least he saw shapes darting along intervals from rock to rock. These young Indians had been well trained in stealth and camouflage. Now, Beadler, like Johnson, must wait till they came to some impasse for which they had not been trained. Beadler had the benefit of Johnson's training in how they might best take advantage of this terrain, but even so, he resolved to let Johnson's rifle speak first.
Oh.
They're baiting him.
And it was just like, it's almost a game to them.
It's like, what's really interesting when you read even Daniel Boone's time and you read about this, because Daniel Boone's time is 100 years earlier.
Right.
And you're talking George Washington, a young Abraham Lincoln when Boone is older. I don't even think Lincoln's born yet then, actually. But you are talking about Andrew Johnson. You're talking about early, all those that signed the Declaration of Independence. George Washington and Daniel Boone, I think, were within a year of each other's age, same age. And even when you read the history of that time frame, and you're talking about them being in Virginia and Pennsylvania and making their way into Kentucky and then later into Missouri and moving west, and you're talking about a different group of Indians when you're talking Iroquois and you're talking the Shawnee and you're talking about the Cherokee. These Indians way over here on the East Coast, but even though there's 100 years apart, you have this battle going on between all these people moving into encroaching their country, and the Indians fighting back as best they can. But there's this continual thing where they are fighting one another, but you have these seasoned men like Johnson, who has killed hundreds of men and has been around a long time. And then you have these young, like, sort of inexperienced warriors. They
don't have the war experience.
That don't have it. And you can see it with a veteran and someone who hasn't been around. You can see it between a 3-point buck and, you know, a 200-inch it's a 7-year-old buck.
It's like there's the same with the hunter on how they spot and stalk and, you know, their experience, you know. I mean.
Mm-hmm. So they bait these guys in here. And it says that at last, one young brave, evidently the leader and bolder than the others, stepped out and advanced to the campfire. Beadler was close enough to see the Indian's black eyes gleam in the firelight. Drawing no attack upon himself, he set the butt of his rifle on the ground and raised one hand in the air. Now, suddenly and silently, the lighted space about the campfire was filled with 20 eager young warriors. Most carried rifles. Beadler could imagine what Johnson would have to say about traders who would sell the tribe so many rifles, and even young men like these had firearms. Like we said, this is not typical.
Yeah.
But it's becoming more typical as you have traders that are out there getting whoever will pay him. They're getting them weapons. The leaders gesticulated, pointing toward where the trappers had led their horses away from the fire. All his men came close to hear what he had to say. Now the rifles opened up on them from both sides of the trail. The party of Blackfeet was caught dead between the two well-hidden trappers. Most of the braves fell in the first burst of lead upon them. But before the remaining few could think what action to take, Johnson and Beadler had emptied their rifles and were among them with revolvers. One did manage to slash Beadler's shoulder with his scalping knife, but of the other Blackfeet, even those who had scant time to raise rifle or fit an arrow to bow had no time for accurate aim. 3 of the full score made their escape, and Johnson was sure that 2 of these were badly wounded. But with even 3 escaped into the darkness, Johnson and Beadler must move away from their campfire. Soon the entire Blackfeet nation would be alerted against them. More immediately, they must stay away from this light which had made the Blackfeet their helpless targets. They did have 2, perhaps 3 minutes for Johnson to take 17 scalps, with Beadler standing guard. They did, no doubt, take along the foe's rifles. Johnson's disturbed that these young warriors, they even have rifles. But in a little more than 5 minutes, the trappers were on horseback, headed for water. Part of it is, too, like, these young warriors, they totally underestimated the white people they were trailing.
Yeah.
You know, they're probably pretty formidable enough, young, strapping, brave-ish, you know, dudes, and they went in there, and they have to be extremely naive to fall for the fire and then to go in and so overconfident because there's 20 of them and only 2 of these guys.
Wait, I kind of think of it as like the hothead 25-year-old, you know, that is gym fit and everything, and he gets in a fight with, like, road rage or something with some 45-year-old dude that's, like, looks like he's just a plain old Jane guy, and he ends up beating the crap out of the young kid, you know?
Right.
Like, it's just a perfect example.
In little more than 5 minutes, the trappers were on horseback, headed for water. Even the packing of Beadler's shoulder wound in herbs from Johnson's saddlebags must wait till they had followed the river where it was shallow and crossed and recrossed several times, tied their trail. When daylight came, the trappers found Johnson's old trapping cabin hidden in the dense underbrush. They spent the hours till dark there, sleeping and watching turn and turn. So they know now that because they killed 20 of these Blackfeet, that the Blackfeet are already mad at him, and they need to get out of there, and so they did. They didn't waste any time. On the second night's ride after their massacre of the Blackfeet, the trappers entered a belt of heavy timber. Beadler had not Delgu's knowledge of this mussel shell country, nor for that matter Del's knack of drawing from Johnson some statement of plans. But when he found himself riding behind Johnson's single file along this well-worn trail, even Beadler remembered what his partner might be doing in this country. By God, he said, this is the trail to Crazy Woman's place. Johnson allowed that Beadler was right, but made no further reply. They rode out of the timber and into the clearing. They dismounted by what was obviously an empty cabin, and the Crow Killer led the way past the cabin to Miss Morgan's 4 mounds, still clearly marked by, but long unattended. So he walked on past to a 5th grave off to one side under a huge cairn of stones, 8 feet or more in height. Jeez. So she's been buried now with the others, and she is in a grave that's like 8 feet of stones stacked on top of it, in a memorial to her. You know she was dead? Beadler asked. I know, Johnson said, and he did explain to Beadler how she had died of starvation. He walked around her cairn. He stopped to inspect the 4 poles set around this grave as around the graveyard. The old woman had tended herself, and to mark the 4 cracked, grinning skulls that sat thereon, crows piled up these stones, he said matter-of-factly. These stones. So the Crow are who buried her and showed her the respect and took care of her dead body.
Right.
Why not Blackfoot's? Blackfoot's hated her and was scared to come here. The trappers had remounted before Beadler pursued the matter. But why the Crows? He asked. The liver eater took a chew of tobacco. Indians are funny critters, he said, chomping furiously. But Beadler knew, as he watched his famed companion, that he had more than tobacco to chew on. The Crows had given such a burial to Crazy Woman out of respect for Johnson, their greatest enemy, her friend. So they didn't really care about Crazy Woman, but because they knew that he took care of her and had built her the cabin and fed her over the years, and they had observed, they knew that she mattered to Johnson. So the Crow buried her, even though the blood feud had gone on. So the Crow have tremendous respect for Jeremiah Johnson, basically, as the legend goes. Yep. Beadler had much to report of Johnson in that spring of 1869. They had come from a winter's work in which only their own strength and skill had kept them alive and won them an income. Johnson had set a sort of score to settle with the Crows. Had a new sort of score to settle with the Crows. The trappers reached Johnson's woodyard on the Missouri in an easy day's ride from Crazy Woman's place. As for years now, his dried cordwood stood in piles ready for purchase by riverboatmen. Like he normally made a little money on the side that way. Beadler watched, fascinated, while the Crow Killer headed for his bank, the knot hole near the top of the gnarled cottonwood stump. Just large enough to admit John Johnson's hand. Johnson pulled out a roll of bills, and while Beadler sat unsadly with it, it's crazy, he has a bank and a stump, you know. He unsaddled the horses and staked them out. He counted the money and looked at what was left of his cordwood. Steamboat men had never been known to renege on payments to woodhawks. I mean, it could cost them everything.
Yeah, right.
Like, no raiding party of Indians had ever burned out the woodyard or broke into the bank. Pretty remarkable. Yeah. Because they could just burn all that wood, you know. Right. It was some time now during Beadler's stay with Johnson that Captain Grant Marsh of the steamer Nile stopped for wood, entertained the 2 mountain men on board. Ice had been obtained from the ice house at Fort Peck, and to celebrate the captain's birthday, ice cream was served. Ooh. Wild. The liver eater. So this is like 1869, and they had ice cream. Dang.
See, people just got it right for a long time.
The liver eater, ashamed to show his ignorance to the passengers, whispered, "X, where in the hell does this stuff come from?" Just as ignorant, Beadler whispered back, "Shut up, fool, it comes in cans." Both gulped the stuff down. It is kind of a miracle, ice cream.
I know.
Ice, like,
throw some salt in there, churn it.
In the summertime.
Yeah.
You know? Beadler had some sort of revenge for such exposure of his and Johnson's innocence. The several ladies on board stared long at the fearsome mountain men, and at last one asked Beadler whether he was married, and Beadler replied that he was, to a squaw man, And where was she now? The enthusiastic passenger asked next. Sent her to Rome, ma'am. How wonderful. To Rome, Italy? Was the obvious next question, but Beadler's answer ended the conversation. No, ma'am, to Rome on the prairie.
Funny guy.
As he sat combing and hooped scalps by the fire in their first nights at the woodyard, Beadler watched his partner smoking, looking into the flames. Johnson had something more on his mind than the riverboat passengers who might look foolish to him, nor were his thoughts concerned now with the replenishing of his wood supply from the vast drifts piled up, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, Beadler would be back in time to help start. For Johnson waited only until Beadler was out of sight, then quickly saddled and mounted his own horse and set off westward. Okay, they split up. This gets a little too wordy sometimes. He knew that there was an encampment of crows somewhere between the mouth of the Mussel Shell and the Judith River, some of them likely the very crows who had built a cairn for Crazy Woman. With him, as a present, Johnson took a 5-gallon keg of whiskey. According to Wide Eye, Johnson thought better of such a gift for young braves. Somewhere on his journey he cached the liquor. After a feud of almost a quarter of a century, the crow killer was ready to make peace with the crows. Braver, more devoted warriors, he knew he had never loosed an arrow, and the body of Crazy Woman had not been left to be torn by wolves.
Huh.
This stuff is you can't make this up. Like, this is just nonsense.
I was gonna say is for all those that were killed and stuff, and between Jeremiah Johnson and John Johnson, and it's like the Crows still had a respect,
for their
enemy,
because of how they comported themselves in battle, and like they didn't cheat, they didn't shoot men in the back and stuff like that. So they basically were like. They lived by a sense of honor,
right?
A code to an extent,
Yep.
The Crow Chief Gray Bear, with 26 braves, was camped where the Judith empties into the Missouri east of Fort Benton. On their way back from trapping on the Milk River north almost into Canada, they were still far from home. Hemmed in by freshets, they were waiting now for the waters to subside before continuing on to Hawley's, where they'd hoped to sell their peltries. Johnson could have waited and met them at the fort, but he determined to meet them alone. At the fort, the presence of many others, white man and Indian alike, must in itself prevent the active prosecution of their feud. By the Judith, Johnson's and the Crows' own forbearance could be acted out in formal ending to their years of vendetta. Basically saying, we need to meet alone so he can kind of settle this thing, because if they're in front of people, they kind of have to fight because I don't know. After a few days by the Judith, the Crows were waiting for more than subsiding of rivers. For now, Blackfeet swarmed all through that countryside. Though not quarrelsome, the Crows would have been willing enough to take on any one of the several hunting parties of Blackfeet which Gray Bear had already seen. But with Blackfeet roaming in bands all along the upper Missouri, a mere rifle shot would have served to bring many of them together. The Crows had not labored through a long and bitter winter merely to provide their enemies with these loads of furs. It was a glad day for them when, well along in April, their scouts reported that the Blackfeet had headed south toward the Yellowstone. Now, Gray Bear could give the long-desired command, "We go." So they have a bunch of stuff they want to trade.
Yep.
By early afternoon, teepees were struck. The sentries were called in. Preparations underway. Graybeard walked the 50 yards from camp into a pocket among some scrub trees where he could drink from a cold spring. He scooped water many times and cupped his palms to quench his thirst. Even as he smacked his wet palms on his buckskin thighs, Gray Bear knew that something was wrong. At the sound of a horse's hoof scraping on the rocks, he swung quickly around, but already the horse had stepped through the brush. Its rider sat looking at him. "Do ye know me, Indian?" said Liver-Eating Johnson. Gray Bear looked at Johnson as if seeing a ghost. "First time I ever seen a red, inward, tarn white," the Liver-Eater told White Eye Anderson years later. So he's just saying, he's bragging that he's scared the Indian.
Yeah.
And Johnson had his palms out in the universal sign of peace, even as Gray Bear half drew his tomahawk. The chief let the weapon slide back down into his belt. But though Gray Bear could take his hand off his weapon, his face bore the mark of his fear and his hatred for the man who had killed his tribesmen through so many years. "You are the white hunter who long ago took the trail against us," he replied. "You are the liver eater." "Right the first whack," said the crow killer, "but I've come to end all that." Gray Bear waited for the killer's explanation. Crazy woman has a monument. She was buried by crows," Gray Bear said, with the white badger and his braves had built the old woman's cairn. "Crow warriors." "Yes, crow warriors," Gray Bear said, "to honor a white woman touched by the Great Spirit and to scorn the Blackfeet," he added. Warmed to his subject, Gray Bear went so far as to invite the old crow killer to join his band in an expedition to Big Dry Creek. But this Johnson thought unwise all around. "Too many young bucks with ya," he said. "It were young bucks that first sent me on your trail." So saying, he gave his mount a sharp slap and rode through the brush, his back a broad target, were it not that he left behind him a friend.
I think we're kind of into this, but it talks. I was reading something earlier the other day, and it was talking about the reason they think that the peace treaty came between John Johnson and the Crow was because all the war going on with all the white men and all the settlers coming across. They think that's a big part of it, because like the Indian tribes were realizing that they need to kind of come together to fight off the white men. So I think that's part of why they agreed on the treaty with John Johnson.
It says that there was exchanges of gifts to be arranged yet with White Badger, the individual Crow chief who had so honored Crazy Woman. But Johnson could count on Gray Bear's passing the word at once that the Crow killer desired friendship. In the months ahead, he would even become their brother in arms. For just as such an individualist as liver-eating Johnson must finally join the forces mustered against frontier-wide Sioux war bands, so too the Crows, after years of indecision, were finally to choose sides. Both must have sympathized with the Sioux anger at the coming of so many settlers and the loss of old hunting grounds, but both finally acted to quell uprisings bloody but doomed to failure. Yeah. Well, so there you have it. That's how he then sort of makes peace with the Crow.
Yep.
He sneaks off, meets a leader where he knew they would be waiting on the trail to go and trade goods because the streams are frozen and whatnot, and because the Blackfeet are roaming around, and so they're trying to just stall for time. And so he knew where he could find them. So he pops down there, interacts with this one guy off on the side, Graybeard, and just says, "Hey, I don't want to do this anymore. You guys did this for me.
He's getting old.
I'm ready for this to be over. Let's call it good." And he brought some gifts.
Yep.
And they traded to the different people who Graybeard passed on the message. So at that point, they then go from enemies to co-conspirators to,
I don't know if you could say friends, but
allies.
Allies.
So pretty crazy, huh?
Yeah.
Now, earlier I had mentioned that Jeremiah Johnson had died in a veterans hospital, and that is true. But I said he had died like on the East Coast.
It's on the West Coast. He died in California.
Okay, so it was California. So that's what I was thinking in my head.
Yeah.
Someone said Wyoming.
No. So his grave is currently in. So how it's funny you bring this up, because I screenshotted this the other day. I was looking at it, and it talks about in 1974, a group of 25 seventh graders led a 6-month campaign to have Johnson's body moved from Los Angeles to Cody, Wyoming. It says their campaign was ultimately successful, and the students organized a disinterment and a reinterment ceremony. Actor Robert Redford, who played the fictionalized version of liver-eating Johnson in the movie Jeremiah Johnson, acted as a pallbearer. And so they transferred him.
Seriously?
His his grave and everything
Okay.
to Cody, Wyoming.
So he did die in California.
Yes.
Because I knew it was some really lefty place.
Yep. Yeah.
So he dies
Los
in California,
Angeles.
but it wasn't the East Coast. Like I had for some reason I had thought it was in a big city. I knew that. So it was California.
Yep.
In a veterans hospital.
Yep.
And you're saying he was reinterned in Cody, Wyoming.
Yes. 1974.
And that's why he's in Cody.
Yep.
Okay, that makes more sense because there was some conflicting comments in the comment section and some things that I had read and I couldn't figure out. I was like, I know I read it. I know it was a veterans hospital. Maybe it wasn't the East Coast. So there you have it. Correction.
Yep.
I probably drove some historical buffs crazy with the comment, but here we go. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the episode. Tune in. We're going to drop another one here shortly in a few more days. Come back, check it out. In the meantime, we appreciate you. We thank you. Like and subscribe to the channel. Leave us a comment. And don't forget to shop over at Go Hunt, Gear Shop, Peaks Equipment, all our partners, Mountain Ops, and Stealthy Nutrition.
Not too late to go get some sheep feet.
Sheep feet, get those or custom orthotics. Mark Livesey is an e-scouting course that's worth every penny. We love all of our partners. We love how they support us and how they help us keep this show going. We love the discounts we can pass on to you with our codes. And it's an everybody wins situation. We like it. So we thank you. We appreciate you. And stay gritty.